In 1637, a single tulip bulb sold for the price of a fine Amsterdam townhouse. By 1642, the Dutch East India Company, a trading company, commanded more firepower than most nations on earth. And by 1799, when it finally collapsed under 134 million guilders of debt, it had enslaved hundreds of thousands, rewritten global trade, and invented the financial instruments that would one day define modern capitalism. Most people think corporations are a modern invention. They're not. The blueprint for corporate power was written 400 years ago, in blood, nutmeg, and stock certificates. And the question no one asks is this: what if the East India Company never really died? What if it just evolved? Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where we uncover how money, power, and history are woven together to shape the world we live in. Today, we're diving into the rise and fall of the most powerful corporation in history, a company so dominant it waged wars, printed its own currency, and governed entire continents. But more importantly, we're revealing how its legacy didn't disappear. It mutated, and it's still here. The year is 1602. Europe is obsessed with spices, not for flavor, for survival. Nutmeg, cloves, and black pepper preserved food through brutal winters, masked the taste of rot, and were literally worth more than their weight in silver. But there was a problem. The spice trade was controlled by Portuguese and Spanish monopolies, and the sea routes to Asia were deadly gauntlets of storms, pirates, and disease. Then, a group of Dutch merchants did something unprecedented. They didn't just form a company. They created the world's first publicly traded corporation, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or VOC, the Dutch East India Company. It wasn't just a business, it was a nation-state in disguise. The VOC was granted powers no modern corporation could dream of: the right to wage war, negotiate treaties, establish colonies, mint currency, and execute justice. It could hang pirates in foreign ports. It could sign binding treaties with Asian kingdoms. It could colonize entire islands in the name of profit. And here's the twist: it was owned by ordinary citizens. For the first time in history, anyone with capital could buy a share in an empire. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first, was born from this radical experiment. But this wasn't progress. It was the birth of a new kind of tyranny, one that didn't need kings or borders, just shareholders. So how did a trading company become more powerful than empires? And what happened when the illusion finally shattered? The birth of a monster. To understand the VOC, you have to understand the desperation that created it. In the late 1500s, the Dutch Republic had just won independence from Spain after 80 years of brutal warfare. They were a tiny nation of merchants and shipbuilders, surrounded by hostile empires. The Spanish controlled the Atlantic, the Portuguese dominated the spice routes to Asia, and the Dutch were bleeding money. Dozens of small Dutch trading companies were sailing to the East Indies, undercutting each other's prices, paying inflated bribes to local rulers, and frequently losing entire fleets to storms and Portuguese warships. Between 1595 and 1602, at least 65 Dutch ships sailed for Asia. Many never returned. The competition was killing them. So in March 1602, the Dutch States General forced a merger. Every competing Dutch trading company east of the Cape of Good Hope was consolidated into one super company, the VOC. The deal was elegant in its brutality. The VOC received a 21-year monopoly on all Dutch trade in Asia. In exchange, it would remit a share of profits to the state and serve as an extension of Dutch military power in the East. But the truly revolutionary innovation was how they raised capital. Instead of relying on a single wealthy patron or royal treasury, the VOC issued shares to the public. Over 1,100 investors, from wealthy merchants to modest shopkeepers, poured in 6.45 million guilders in the initial offering. It was the largest capital raise in human history up to that point, and those shares could be traded on the newly established Amsterdam Stock Exchange. The world's first publicly traded corporation had just been born. But here's what made it truly dangerous. The VOC wasn't just accountable to one king or one parliament. It was accountable to over 1,000 shareholders, all demanding returns. And returns required expansion. Expansion required violence. The shareholders didn't care about morality, they cared about dividends. And the VOC was about to deliver, in ways that would redefine brutality. Blood and nutmeg. By 1619, the VOC had established its Asian headquarters in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, on the ruins of the Javanese port city of Jayakarta, which they'd burned to the ground. From there, they spread like an infection. The VOC didn't just trade, it conquered. Local rulers were forced to sign exclusive contracts at gunpoint. If they refused, VOC soldiers torched their crops, sank their ships, and blockaded their ports until starvation forced compliance. But the Banda Islands, that's where the VOC revealed its true nature. The Banda Archipelago was the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally. Control Banda, and you controlled the global nutmeg supply. The VOC knew this. So did the Bandanese. In 1621, Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, a man who once wrote, "There is nothing in the world that gives a man more courage than money," led an invasion force of 2,000 soldiers and Japanese mercenaries to Banda. The Bandanese population numbered around 13,000 to 15,000. They resisted. Cohen's response was systematic annihilation. Conservative estimates suggest 2,500 to 6,000 Bandanese were killed in direct combat or executed. The remaining population, thousands more, died from starvation, disease, or were enslaved and deported to Batavia. By the time the VOC finished, only about 1,000 Bandanese remained on islands that once held 15,000. The VOC then replanted Banda with Dutch colonists and enslaved labor from across Asia. Nutmeg production was industrialized, profits exploded, and the shareholders in Amsterdam? They received their dividends in barrels of nutmeg, which they sold at markup in European markets. On the Amsterdam Exchange, VOC shares soared. By the 1640s, the company was paying dividends that occasionally spiked to 40–50% in exceptional years, though average returns were closer to 12 to 18% annually, often paid in spices rather than cash. Still, for investors, it was a golden age. By 1669, the VOC controlled trade across the Indonesian archipelago, had permanent trading posts in India, Japan, Taiwan, Sri Lanka, Persia, and South Africa, and employed over 70,000 people, more than the standing armies of most European nations. It was the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen. But power built on monopoly and violence carries the seeds of its own destruction. Because the VOC's business model had a fatal flaw, it required infinite growth in a finite world. The illusion cracks. In February 1637, something bizarre happened in Amsterdam. Tulip bulbs, yes, flowers, became the center of a speculative frenzy. Rare bulb varieties were traded like commodities. Futures contracts were written on flowers that hadn't even bloomed. Prices spiraled to absurd heights. A single Semper Augustus bulb sold for 5,000 to 6,000 guilders, enough to buy a fine Amsterdam canal house. Then on February 3, 1637, a bulb auction in Haarlem failed to attract buyers. Panic spread. Within days, tulip prices collapsed by 95%. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Now here's the interesting part. Tulipmania barely touched the VOC. The company's shares weren't part of the speculation. Its Asian trade operations continued uninterrupted. In fact, the 1640s were among its most profitable decades. But Tulipmania revealed something crucial about the Dutch financial system, and by extension, about the VOC. It showed that Dutch markets were driven not by fundamentals, but by belief. As long as people believed tulip bulbs or VOC shares would rise in value, they did. The moment belief wavered, everything collapsed. And by the 1670s, belief in the VOC's invincibility was starting to crack. The company's directors, the Heren 17th or the 17 Gentlemen, were a closed oligarchy of wealthy merchants in Amsterdam. They operated in near-total secrecy. Shareholders rarely saw detailed financial records. Embezzlement was rampant. Governors in Asia ruled like feudal lords, hoarding profits, ignoring orders, and running personal trading operations on the side. Meanwhile, operational costs were skyrocketing. Wars with England, Portugal, and local Asian kingdoms drained resources. Maintaining forts, paying armies, and replacing ships lost to storms and combat cost more each year. Spice prices in Europe were falling due to oversupply and competition from English and French rivals. And yet, the VOC kept paying dividends, because stopping dividends would trigger a stock collapse. So the company borrowed, and borrowed, and borrowed. By the 1770s, the VOC was essentially a Ponzi scheme, paying dividends with borrowed money while actual trade profits declined towards zero. Then came the breaking point. In 1780, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War erupted. Britain, now the dominant naval power, systematically destroyed Dutch trade. VOC ships were captured or blockaded in port. Asian trade routes were severed. For the first time in its 178-year history, the VOC posted a net loss, and the illusion shattered. The ghost in the machine. By 1795, the VOC was a hollowed-out shell. Its debts had ballooned to 134 million guilders against assets worth only 24 million. That's a net debt of 110 million guilders, a sum so staggering it would take the Dutch Republic decades to pay off. On December 31st, 1799, the Dutch government officially dissolved the VOC. Its assets, ships, forts, colonies, trading posts, were nationalized. Its debts were absorbed by the state. After nearly 200 years, the world's first megacorporation was dead. But here's what didn't die: the system. The VOC had pioneered financial mechanisms that would define the next 3 centuries. Limited liability. Shareholders could only lose their initial investment, not their entire fortune. This encouraged risk-taking at a societal scale. Publicly traded shares, anyone with capital could own a piece of empire. This democratized imperialism and diffused moral responsibility. Separation of ownership and control. Shareholders didn't run the company. Managers did. This created the principal-agent problem that still plagues modern corporations. Perpetual expansion as a business model. Growth wasn't optional. It was existential. Stagnation meant death. And perhaps most importantly, profit as moral justification. If an action increased shareholder value, it was defensible. Massacres became market efficiency. Slavery became labor optimization. The Dutch government didn't dismantle the VOC's colonial apparatus. They inherited it. The Dutch East Indies remained a colony until 1949, 150 more years of extraction, exploitation, and systematic theft of resources. The wealth pumped out of Indonesia funded the Netherlands' industrial development, infrastructure, and cultural institutions. Meanwhile, the VOC's blueprint spread. The British East India Company, watching the VOC's success, adopted the same model. By 1857, it controlled the entire Indian subcontinent, ruling over 400 million people while answering to shareholders in London. The VOC had proven something terrifying. A corporation could be more powerful than a nation and face none of the accountability. And that idea never went away. It just got refined. The new East India Companies. Let's talk about 2024. Apple's market capitalization is $3.5 trillion. That's larger than the GDP of France. Microsoft's value exceeds $3 trillion. Amazon, Google, Nvidia. Each commands more economic power than most countries. And like the VOC, these corporations operate beyond the effective reach of any single government. They lobby for favorable tax laws. They route profits through offshore structures. When nations try to regulate them, they threaten to leave. When workers try to organize, they offshore operations. When markets become saturated, they expand into new territories, not with warships, but with apps, algorithms, and infrastructure. But here's where it gets eerie. In 2021, a Facebook whistleblower named Frances Haugen leaked internal documents showing that Facebook's algorithms were intentionally designed to maximize engagement, even when the company's own research showed this was radicalizing teenagers, spreading vaccine misinformation during a pandemic, inciting ethnic violence in Myanmar and Ethiopia, damaging children's mental health. Facebook knew and did nothing. Because engagement drove ad revenue drove shareholder value. Sound familiar? The VOC knew its policies were causing mass death in the Banda Islands. Company records explicitly document the massacres. But the Here in 17 didn't intervene. Because nutmeg monopoly drove profits, profits drove dividends, dividends drove stock prices. The mechanism hasn't changed, it's just been digitized. Let's talk about the financial system. In 2008, the global economy collapsed because investment banks had packaged subprime mortgages into complex securities, sold them to investors worldwide, and when the underlying assets failed, the entire system seized up. It's the same speculative mania that drove Tulipmania in 1637. The same belief-driven bubble that kept VOC shares inflated even as the company rotted from within. Millions lost their homes. $10 trillion in global wealth evaporated. But the banks, they were bailed out. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America, all received government rescue packages. Why? Because they were too big to fail. The VOC made the same argument in the 1790s. Dutch politicians knew the company was bankrupt, corrupt, and morally indefensible. But they couldn't let it collapse. Too many pensions, government bonds, and merchant fortunes were tied to its stock. So they nationalized the losses and dissolved it quietly. History didn't repeat, it rhymed. Now here's the deeper connection. The VOC pioneered quarterly profit expectations. Shareholders demanded regular updates. Directors learned to manage short-term stock prices rather than long-term sustainability. Today, every major corporation operates on this same 90-day cycle. CEOs are incentivized with stock options tied to quarterly earnings. If they miss projections, they're fired. So they cut costs, lay off workers, buy back stock, anything to hit the number. Long-term planning, environmental sustainability, worker welfare, those are externalities, just like the Bandanese were externalities to nutmeg production. So here's the answer to our original mystery. Did the Dutch East India Company ever really die? No, it didn't die. It metastasized. It became the operating system of global capitalism. Every publicly traded corporation is a descendant of the VOC. Every stock exchange traces its lineage to Amsterdam, 1602. Every shareholder lawsuit, every hostile takeover, every private equity acquisition, they're all speaking the language the VOC invented. The company is gone, but its DNA is everywhere. 3 lessons from the first corporate empire. Let me leave you with 3 uncomfortable truths. Lesson 1. Power doesn't need a crown. It just needs a quarterly earnings report. The VOC proved that corporations, not kings, could rule the world. They could wage war, write laws, and govern millions, all while answering only to shareholders. Today, that model is everywhere. When Amazon decides which businesses live or die through its marketplace policies, it's exercising sovereign power. When Apple controls what apps you can use through its App Store, it's legislating. When pharmaceutical companies decide which diseases are profitable to cure, they're making life and death decisions that once belonged to governments. We never had a conversation about whether this was a good idea. The VOC just made it normal. Lesson 2. Every bubble is the same bubble wearing a different costume. Tulips in 1637, railway stocks in 1840s, radio stocks in 1920s, dot-com stocks in 1999, housing in 2007, cryptocurrency in 2021. The pattern never changes. A new asset class emerges, early adopters profit, media hypes it, ordinary people pile in, belief sustains prices far beyond fundamentals, then someone blinks, and it all collapses. The VOC stock followed the same arc. For decades, it seemed invincible. Then suddenly it wasn't. The bubble always pops. The only question is who's still holding the bag when it does. Lesson 3. We're still living in the VOC's world. We've just stopped noticing. Every time you check your 401k balance, you're participating in the system the VOC built. Every time a company announces layoffs and its stock price rises, you're seeing VOC logic in action. Every time a pharmaceutical company prices insulin at $300 a vial because shareholders demand growth, you're witnessing the Banda Islands massacre in slow motion. The VOC normalized the idea that profit justifies anything, and we've internalized it so completely that we don't even see it anymore. So here's the final question. If the VOC's legacy is exploitation dressed as efficiency, monopoly dressed as innovation, and violence dressed as market forces, what are we building right now that future historians will look back on with horror? Because in the world of wealth and power, history never ends. It just changes hands. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because the next story might just rewrite what you thought you knew about power. Until next time, stay curious and stay skeptical.